Royden Loewen was a historian of Mennonite history and former chair in Mennonite studies at the University of Winnipeg, now retired and currently an organic farmer. Today we'll be discussing his book, Mennonite Farmers, A Global History of Place and Sustainability, published by the University of Manitoba Press in 2021. So thank you for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
So very first question, how did you get into the field of history? What made you want to study Mennonite history? What spurred the interest on localism that you're kind of tying throughout this book?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I think I made that discovery quite early in my life. In fact, I think I was going to go into architecture and I needed physics in grade 11 for it. And I was too late to realize that. And so I found myself not going down that route. And then I was off to university thinking I might become a lawyer. And then I bumped into my very first year as an 18-year-old, Dr. George Epp, who was a Mennonite historian here in Winnipeg. And he just dazzled me in our Western civilization history class. And I think this is by way of confession, I think my only A in my first year, as I was trying to figure out what avenue of study I wanted to engage in, was that history course. And then I left the idea of going to law and began thinking of myself as a potential history teacher. I then did a 2-year stint at a Indigenous First Nation as a social studies teacher from grade 7 to grade 12. My heaviest teaching load, I think, in my career. During which time, a local teacher from my home community of Blumenort, north of Steinbach in southeastern Manitoba, approached me whether I would be able to help her put together a history book for her grade 6 class of 12-year-olds or whatever it was. And I said sure. And that little booklet, helping with that booklet, turned into a 600-page local history of Blumenort, which then became my MA thesis after the fact. Having written it, I decided to go to Professor Gerald Friesen at the University of Manitoba and said, hey, if I want to do an MA, what would I need to do to turn this 600-page monster into an MA thesis? And he read it and he says, this is an MA thesis. So I was, so my, the trajectory, both in terms of local history, because I'm glad you asked about that, because that's always been important. And yeah, the professional task of historians, was set quite early.
And so are you particularly, is your study of history kind of also telling your own family history? And that's why you kind of have leaned more into agricultural history, Mennonite history?
Oh, I think we all do that as historians, right? I think if you scratch the surface of many historians, you find them being implicitly autobiographical in some respect. So certainly, yeah. So Blumenort, my first book, was my home community. Family Church of Market, which was my PhD dissertation, dealt with the Kleingemeinde Mennonites, who are my particular denomination, and it turned out that the Kleingemeinde settled both in Canada and the US, so it was a perfect platform to analyze in comparative fashion how settler groups adapt to their respective societies and two countries. And yeah, I think the Kleingemeinde was also my postdoc at the University of Chicago, where I took them into the mid 20th century. Yeah, and then it's sort of flared out from there.
Yeah, a lot of your books, I've read a couple of them at least, and all of them are very comparative. A lot of them have a local focus. I think this is probably the biggest comparative history of it being 7 places rather than 2 or so, and so many different countries. What draws you to the comparative approach, and what would you say are the pros and cons of this global study of 7 different localities?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I have to reflect on that for a moment. Why am I drawn to comparative approach? Maybe it's my psychological makeup. I'm at once drawn to the local and at the same time sort of repelled by it because I get claustrophobic and I want to. But I'm drawn to the local. I mean, Wendell Berry and everything is beautiful, but the local. I mean, you mentioned in the intro that I'm a certified farmer, certified organic farmer with my son, Sasha. And part of my farming now in my retirement years, following the, 25 years at the University of Winnipeg, is meeting local people and, having, being on the phone. I was just, within the last week, right? I've sat down and had coffee with a Ukrainian Catholic couple from who purchased alfalfa from me. Sam Appleby, an immigrant from Central England, who's a dairy farmer who owes me money from for alfalfa. And Mennonite folks that I spent an hour on the phone with a guy called Marcus Isaac, who's a Holdeman Mennonite, because he's also a hemp producer as we are, about the pros and cons, and telling him that the best teacher in agriculture is your neighbor, and so that there's both there's a cultural deeply rooted cultural affinity to the local, but then at the same time I'm very curious, always beyond the local. And so, yeah, it's a good observation that my PhD dissertation was comparative study of two communities, one in Nebraska and one in Manitoba, and that the most recent one is, based on the 7 Points on Earth research project, which resulted in the Mennonite Farmers book, published by the University of Manitoba Press here in Canada, but by Johns Hopkins in the United States. It's the local that has the flesh and blood, human experience that I'm drawn to and have always been drawn to as a social historian. But it's the comparative that allows you to do global analysis, which is something that I'm innately curious about. And I think, as I argue in Mennonite Farmers, you can't know the local unless you know the global, and you certainly can't know the global unless you know the local.
Right.
So I think that's just the equation. And of course, there's macro analysis, but I'm always bored by macro analysis. I want to meet people, real people.
So you incorporated lots of different types of research for this book, but it was, again, primarily interview. But you also noted that quite a bit of it was diaries and memoirs. You made an interesting distinction between diary and memoir. But I was more curious, what was the most, in this entire collaborative event, what was the most unusual source that you ended up using, or that you found that you thought of, oh, how did he get that?
Oh, right. Yeah, there were so many unusual sources. So 7 Points on Earth is based, it compares communities that have vastly different caches of primary data. So Iowa, of the 7 places, Iowa, I don't know. There's a local civic culture
Yeah.
I think within United States society, but Mennonite sub-societies too, especially Western European diasporic communities, that Mennonites just have, even in pre-industrial times, had a relatively high sense of literacy, sense of self-identity as a minority group, so that those are cultural factors that just lead to the generation of personal records. And they're diasporic people, so there's letter collections and like you say, there's diaries and memoirs, and I think that's almost implicit to Mennonite culture. I did produce a book titled From the Inside Out, which is a collection of 21 diaries And I talk about that there. But having said that, the 7 Points on Earth also dealt with Indonesia, where the level of literacy is probably the least amongst the 7 places I studied. There wasn't a single diary or a memoir by a farmer from Margarecho. And then Siberia in Russia, was another challenge, because there was literacy and memoirs and so on, but given the Iron Curtain that kept that community out from the outside purview for 3 generations, a lot of these materials are not in central archives. And also, fortunately, we did our research there, and again, 7 Points on Earth are premised on the idea that we had a team of 7 graduate students or postgraduate students, all of who had linguistic expertise in the relevant languages. So Dr. Aileen Friesen, who is now a director at the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg, at that point was a recent postdoc, and she did her research in Aplanovka in 2012 or thereabouts, when archives were already somewhat closed in Russia, and now they would be completely closed. So we were very fortunate to be able to get in there. So I think the most novel primary source, well, and I should hasten to add that an early decision that we would have to use oral history as a backbone of this whole thing was premised on the idea of this really sort of uneven set of records that we had. So in Iowa, Manitoba, we have really rich personal records. Russia is very closed, and Indonesia, non-existent. But we grabbed whatever we could. I mean, in Indonesia, I think one of the only primary records. Oh no, there's two. Yeah, and you make this up, right? So Indonesia, the village of Margarecho, the way we got at a sense of what happened there in the early 20th century was by going to a German language newspaper stemming from the Mennonite colonies in the Russian Empire, and work on the assumption that we knew that there have been missionaries sent from present-day Ukraine to Indonesia, the Dutch colonies, and that there must be missionary reports in those newspapers. And sure enough, there were. And so we had some very detailed reports of visiting Margarecho as a village by these missionaries. And of course, you have to stand back and see what's, it's filtered by the missionary eyes. And if a missionary says, I came to Margarecho and it's a horrible place because the children don't obey their parents. They need a sense of good sort of Germanic law and order here, and kind of laissez-faire approach of parenting. This cannot augur well for the future generations. It's like you have to flip that over and say, well, yeah, you've just given us an amazing cultural insight into the social dynamics of this particular farm village. So yeah, and I think the Russian Empire, like again, what's been really interesting is that for 3 generations we didn't hear from the Mennonites in the Soviet Union, right? The doors were just closed. And now in 1989, 1991, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening up of that society, suddenly here are these memoirs written by elderly women recounting, their life stories, totally intertwined with the suffering that occurs on a collective farm, and agency that sometimes they felt working on the collective farm. So yeah, many different kinds of sources.
So This might be a very complicated question, or it might be very simple. We'll see. Uh, so you're talking about Mennonite farmers in all these different locations, and you're saying that they each have their own kind of view of what it means to be a Mennonite farmer. Sometimes it's implicit, where they, okay, I am a part of this trajectory of Mennonite. Some of it's more or explicit. Some of it's more implicit, where it's they don't even consider themselves Mennonite, but they are part of this a Mennonite project. So,
Mhm.
what is it exactly that is? What is a Mennonite farmer? What are these ties that bind these 7 communities together? Uh,
Yeah,
Considering some of them are a little bit disparate.
yeah. No, and Sam, that's kind of the central the central how should I say, challenging post-publication question that has been posed to me. And it rises in part from Johns Hopkins University Press insisting that 7 Points on Earth was not a good title of the book. Which I, of course, thought it was a beautiful title, because it showed its ambition, its scope of reach, etc. And they said, no, it's completely meaningless, and they're right. 7 Points on Earth doesn't mean anything unless you're, Roy Loewen, who's mesmerized by your own project. And so they suggested Mennonite Farmers, and I said, well, on one hand, it isn't really about Mennonite farmers. It's about farmers who happen to be linked to the Mennonite world in some respect. And in a sense, I'm set out not so much to make a point about what is Mennonite agriculture, but rather what is agriculture in a global community when you do a comparative study of 7 places on Earth. And as chair in Mennonite studies, I happen to have created rapport with Mennonites around the world. And given my agricultural background, whenever I traveled, I wanted to visit Mennonite farmers. And so that when the project began in 2012, all the 7 places on Earth that comprise the range of this research, there's only one place I had not visited yet, and that was Iowa. So Iowa for me was the most exotic of the 7 places. And so I visited Iowa after the fact. In fact, John Eicher, who I had identified as a researcher for the project in the US, I wanted to send him to Kansas. And he resided in Iowa City at that time doing his PhD at the university there. And he convinced me to do Iowa because because he happened to live there, and also because it's from a global perspective, everybody in the world knows where Iowa is, because the Iowa caucuses are there
Yeah.
to begin the selection of the world's most powerful person. And so I was actually keen to study to study Iowa. And now I confess I have I've strayed. What was it? What was that question again, Sam?
What does it mean to be a Mennonite? Because
Oh yeah,
I kind of get at this because there seems to be an indication that it has something to do with agrarian simplicity, and you're kind of trying to deal with this.
right. Yes, but just to say that I think because I titled the book Mennonite Farmers then, and before all the revisions were due, I found myself spinning things to try to say something meaningful about what a Mennonite farmer was.
Mm,
But concluding really early on that there really isn't a defining definition of what a Mennonite farmer is,
okay.
and that you can talk. I mean, recent environmental studies from Kelvin Redekop's collection on Anabaptists and environment and so on. You always have these two sort of voices that are occurring at one time. That Mennonites are historically nonviolent, especially in the diaspora, and pacifist, and that somehow must then equate to a particular sort of environmental ethos. But then typically within these collections, you have as many voices saying Mennonites, scolding Mennonites,
Hmm.
having developed for not having extended their pacifism to environment interaction, and that even the Amish, who are often held up as kind of the citadel of environmental stewardship, are actually not are not environmentalists, right?
Hmm.
They're indirectly they have a stewardship of the environment because they believe in simplicity, and simplicity means that they might not engage in the latest technology, or certainly in scales of the economy within a capitalist society. Um, and so I struggled with that, and I think I'm transparent in the introduction that I struggle with it. So on one hand, there is, especially in the diaspora and by happenstance within mission societies in Zimbabwe and Indonesia, an idea that as disciples of Christ, we engage simplicity, and certainly one of the best places to engage simplicity is on the land as farmers. And
Hmm.
I think that's a teaching that you'll find throughout the Mennonite history, especially in the diaspora, um, and all the places that is probably hardest to pin down this idea of a Mennonite farmer is the Netherlands, where the majority of early Anabaptists in the 16th century were actually not farmers. They were craftsmen and crafts families. And most of them were actually residents of small towns and not, country folks. And if there were farmers, they tended to be capitalists located within Haarlem and other communities in Friesland who owned land. And Menno Simons, if you look at what Menno Simons has to say about farmers, it's much more negative than positive, even though we think circumstantially Menno himself was from a Mennonite farm. But he is quite eager to castigate greed amongst capitalist-oriented farmers, and he is to wax eloquently about
Hmm.
the you call like romantic simplicity of Mennonite farmers. So so that's no doubt an unsatisfying answer, but it's a complicated question.
I figured it would either be a two word answer or very, very difficult to answer. Um, you one of the things I liked about this book is it's very well balanced of both being comparative but giving each different place of kind of equal treatment, and it's very interestingly organized in different themes, but each theme is given equal treatment. So I was curious, how did you come up with the different themes, and were there any themes you would have liked to investigate, but when you guys were together discussing what themes to go over for the questions, it was not outvoted, but like these other themes just seemed more important.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, just on a technical level, I mentioned the research team that allowed this project to occur, because we did interviews in 7 different languages, and so there's no way that um, that I could have approached completing this project without that kind of team approach. And then we use the same team we met in Amsterdam at the Doopsgezinde Sociëteit headquarters in downtown Amsterdam for a workshop in December 2013. And that's where we developed the interview instrument to say, okay, what are the themes? And religion is one because it's Mennonite, environment, and so it was explicitly an environmental history project. If it's environmental history, you want to know about your interactions with the climatic events and climate change, and what's standard about agriculture in these various communities. And again, it being comparative in analysis, we wanted to know, gain an understanding of what the different sort of levels or the different obstacles were. I mean, how do you Indonesia has 120 inches of rain per year. Siberia has 15 inches of rain per year. Zimbabwe even less. So that just, I think we wanted to also use the comparative analysis to identify historical information. And so the comparative analysis itself, in a sense, determined what some of the questions were. I've always been interested in gender and women's history related to the farm. And so, and we interviewed slightly more men than women. And so gender was at the very get-go was a topic. And it being global in nature, biopower, or the role of the state within the local communities was a very significant factor, because you can't do Siberia without discussing communism. You can't do Zimbabwe and Indonesia without discussing post-colonial economic policies. You can't discuss U.S. or in Manitoba or Canada without talking about settler colonialism. And so there were these themes that came to the front just because of the comparative nature of the project.
Gotcha. I was asked because I was curious, because I thought that I would have liked to see maybe something more on agricultural innovation or how they changed practices over time. Because you did note it a couple different times that they do change practices. They go from one crop to the other. And I thought it was very interesting, because Mennonites are considered such a traditional group. How do Mennonites balance this like culture of tradition and maintenance of that culture with like kind of a business outlook for innovation and knowing when to try a different kind of crop?
Yeah, and I'll warn you again that my grandkids will be.
We can make this the last question
now, and when you hear the doorbell go multiple times, we'll have to call this the end of this part, at least. Yeah, again, Sam, this is a huge. There's a literature on this. I think one of my favorite articles was E.K. Francis, who is a sociologist. I think he worked at Notre Dame in the US. He's, I think, Austrian born. He did his PhD on Manitoba in the 1950s. And he writes his article on that very question. And certainly one of the equations is always that Mennonites allow themselves economic innovation insofar as that innovation is required to ensure simplicity. So that's full of irony. But that does mean and that doesn't hold true for the Amish, of course, or for the horse and buggy Mennonites, who will draw the line at a different place. But historically, it is the answer to what levels of technology you allow. And I think even the Amish and the horse and buggy Mennonites would subscribe, at least implicitly, to that formula. And so that both the Amish in Iowa and the horse and buggy Mennonites in Bolivia that comprise parts of the study allow tractors. They'll use horses for transportation, but they both readily hire vans and taxis to drive them places, because that's just necessary to maintain the economic underpinning of these communities in which they seek to live simply. And so the tractors, so both the Amish in Iowa and the old colony in Bolivia, who have not ever spoken to one another in 500 years, both have settled on, we will use steel-wheeled tractors. We will allow that much technology because we have to, because horse-drawn implements somehow haven't proven themselves economically sustainable in those communities. And then you have, similar sort of equations, I think, when it comes to Iowa and Manitoba, or to Friesland, especially in Iowa and Manitoba, you get that, especially historically, earlier on in the 20th century. So what do you allow and what do you not allow? And there's always that debate. So yes, you allow GPS tractors, GPS-driven tractors, because they're economically viable, or they will enhance the economic strength of your household and your village. But Should a local farmer buy a, a Learjet to jet them to homes in Palm Springs and back and forth? That would raise eyebrows because that's conspicuous consumption. That definitely undermines that teaching. Again, implicit teaching on simplicity that you still see. So I drive a Ford Lightning truck, which is a ridiculously expensive truck, only because I have a pension, or I decided to splurge on that. But it's an electric truck, and so I think it works perfectly with my implicit sort of commitment to simplicity. But it's again a good question, and there's quite a large literature on that very question.